listening to Season 7 of the podcast, Belonging to Blackness. I'm your host, Dr. Yndia. Good day, people. I'm your host, Dr. Yndia, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, Belonging to Blackness, a space where we explore the depths of Black identity, memory, spirituality, and the ways our histories continue to live in our bodies, beliefs, and the ways of our becoming. Today's conversation invites us into the sacred in-between, the places where ancestral traditions, survival, and faith intersect. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Dianne M Stewart, the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Emory University. She is a distinguished religion scholar, professor, and leading voice in the study of African diasporic religious traditions. Dianne is widely respected for her work examining the spiritual worlds of African descendants, particularly how traditions such as Orisha devotion, hoodoo, and Vodun have coexisted, resisted, and at times merged with Christianity under the pressures of enslavement, colonialism, and racial violence. Her books, Three Eyes for the Journey, Black Women, Black Love, and Obia, Orisha, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, Volume 2, challenges us to rethink what we call religion and how Black people have historically crafted sacred worlds that honor both ancestral memory and contemporary survival. Dianne's scholarship has been recognized with numerous honors, including being named 2025 Guggenheim Fellow for her ongoing work on the transnational legacies of African Christianity. Looking forward to a conversation about inheritance, contradiction, reverence, and reclamation. And I hope you are too. Welcome, Dianne.
Thank you so much, Yndia, for inviting me to this podcast. It's a delight to be here.
We're looking forward to you sharing your journey with our listeners. So are you ready?
I am ready.
Give Black Alliance is proud to support the podcast Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, hosted by Yndia Lork Wilmot. The podcast is an exploration of all aspects of our Black communities, including gifts of time, talent, and treasure, while shedding a positive light on the African descendant experience globally. The Give Black Alliance informs, reforms, and transforms philanthropy to acknowledge and partner with our communities in order to bring about equitable change for all. To learn more about Give Black Alliance, visit us at giveblackalliance.org.
Act 1, Call to Adventure. So Dianne, I've always remarked that much of what inspires us and gives us purpose is autobiographically rooted. So you were born in Kingston, Jamaica, and grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, before pursuing studies at Colgate, at Harvard's Divinity School, and then Union Theological Seminary. But take us back to those formative years. Can you share a bit about your personal journey? What first drew you to the study of religion and specifically to African diasporic spiritual traditions?
Yndia, I grew up attending Catholic schools from the age of 6 to 18. When you attend Catholic schools, even as a very young child, you have to think about religion. You're placed in contexts where you're being fed theology, theological principles and ideas and values. As a child, you're evaluating them, you're taking them in, you're being indoctrinated to an extent, but you're also evaluating them against your experiences. So I grew up in a very ecumenical world because at home I was attending primarily Jamaican immigrant United Methodist congregation. My parents both grew up in what I would call more sanctified traditions, Pentecostal and Baptist, but when they met in Kingston and started their family there, they began attending a United Methodist church, and they continued that once we moved to Hartford, Connecticut. And I think part of the reason was that that church was just full of Jamaican immigrants, so it felt comfortable. And so I was having that experience in my personal kind of every week life. We were very involved in the church. I was involved in my youth group, choir. I used to play the piano. I played the piano for the youth group. So very involved there, but going to Catholic schools. I was bused out to what were predominantly white neighborhoods to attend school early. And then when I started going to the Catholic school that my sister and brother were already attending, I received that kind of education as well. One of my best friends in the neighborhood was Pentecostal. There are a lot of Pentecostal churches in Hartford, Connecticut. And so as an early teenager, maybe 13, 14, I can remember going to church with her a lot. That experience was kind of around me through family members here and there as well. And then one of my neighbors was Southern Baptist, African American, probably National Baptist Convention. I would sometimes go to her church. So I had a kind of ecumenical Christian experience growing up. And of course, we were exposed to aspects of Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism through our religious studies curriculum as we moved along into high school. So religion was something I thought about and was interested in. I think the early experiences that illustrated to me that I was interested is remembering particular rituals and rites that I would see in different kinds of religious contexts, but also those informal ways of addressing problems and moving through different life phases that were embedded in my familial Jamaican culture that often were accompanied by whispers. Someone's sick and they can't figure out what to do. Then there are these other kinds of remedies that are deeply spiritual, but they're not Christian. Or even if they involve Christian texts from the Bible or some Christian aspects, it's being incorporated into what I eventually came to know was more of an African spiritual framework, an African orientation to religion and the divine. Those kinds of things were intriguing to me, around sickness and health, around how to operate when someone died, especially if someone died in a kind of controversial situation. Those experiences, the things I heard, the things I saw, those things stuck with me. And I also saw different kinds of rituals in the homes of some of my classmates. When I would attend their birthday parties or be at their homes for whatever reason, I can remember during the Lenten season actually seeing little dishes of food offerings in front of statues. My friends explaining that we want to give Jesus water and food because he might be hungry. And it's just fascinating things that I was just like, well, this is not really what we're being taught in formal catechism. These are the practices of the people. These are the conventions that hold the deep psychic and religious consciousness of the people together and provide deeper levels of meaning and fulfillment and satisfaction to religious subjects. So I didn't know that at the time, but I was intrigued by that. And I was intrigued by distinction, the dissonance between what was being professed versus what was being practiced. Of course, there's a lot of alignment, but there were places where there was not alignment, and that intrigued me. By the time I went to college, began to take a lot of Black studies courses. We had a phenomenal professor in the religion department, African-American man, Dr. Josiah Young. I took so many courses with him. And I felt like when he was teaching us African religions, he didn't really teach Caribbean religions. I had to do independent studies on my own to do that. But when he was teaching African religions, it felt so comfortable to me. I felt like it explained so many things that I have seen in the wider cosmos of Black religious experience, consciousness, and activity. It began to offer a framework for understanding my own religious background or aspects of it that are often silenced or muted. His classes also showed me the significance of religion to Black people's very survival in the diaspora, coming through chattel slavery, what it meant to be fungible property, movable property that could just be replaced by another basic body if this one dropped dead. How do you get through that?
Mhm.
How do you get through thingification? That began to capture me because I firmly believe that the principal way that people of African descent who have been subjected to racialized chattel enslavement have negotiated that, managed it, survived it, maybe even thrived at times, was through their religious imagination, was through their religious heritage and their adaptability and flexibility in new, foreign, strange, and torturous contexts, through their spiritual intelligence and religious cultures.
How do you understand the difference or the overlap between religion and spiritual practice? And I ask this question with the context of folk tradition. These sorts of traditions and spiritual practices are often dismissed. So I think about Zora Neale Hurston, how she focused on revealing hoodoo as a complex spiritual system of healing and divination and cultural expression that's rooted in African traditions. The same traditions that you just said felt very familiar and it made sense. Something clicked. She also documented in her work Tell My Horse, asserting its validity as a religion.
Right. First of all, India, the Western academic elevation of literacy and writing, not just as a technology, but as a form of intelligence, is in many respects responsible for the denigration of folk life, folk culture. There were times in my own training that I didn't want to use that term. I didn't want to really embrace it because it came with so much baggage. You know, the way I feel about terms like magic and witchcraft, I do not personally use those terms. It's already been demonized in the European context. I mean, that's a whole study on its own. But then it gets transported into Africana context with the baggage that it's carrying. It's not really useful from my perspective. And I can say more about that if you'd like me to. When we talk about folk or folk traditions, we're really talking about practices, beliefs, knowledges that are not institutionalized per se. They are learn through imitation, the way cultures hold those sacred, meaningful ways of being and acting conventions together to give a community a sense of peoplehood. These kinds of traditions are often unstated, they're assumed, they're also passed down through orature. And in the era of AI, I am thinking about coming back to the classroom in the fall and literally saying, look, the bulk of our experience together in terms of your acquisition of knowledge is going to be through oral examination. You know,
Right.
you will do some writing, but you are going to have to do oral exams. And it reminded me of how much we have denigrated orature. We have undervalued orature, but orature has been such an important way for peoples and cultures for generations, for centuries to ground themselves in a particular identity that gives them purpose and helps them establish their values. So that's what we mean by folk traditions. And folklore is an amazing field of study. I can always tell when I'm reading something that's by an anthropologist versus an anthropologist who is a folklorist. Folklorists are trained to pay attention to those informalities as they appear in music and dance and orature and material culture. Anthropologists are too, but folklorists bring a different kind of attention to those informal conventions that I think is so important. When we talk about religion, and I'm speaking now as a scholar of religion, I'm speaking more in a generalized sense because I even personally adopt a historian of religion kind of perspective to religion, which particularly the scholar of comparative religions, history of religions, Charles Long's understanding that religion is orientation. But I don't even want to go there right now. When we talk about religion generally, most people will associate it with institutional life of some form. And that's a distinction I would make as well between religion and spirituality. If we break down the word religion, We get to the Latin root word religare, to tie, to bind, to connect, to attach. We already can understand how that root word connects to the things in our minds that we are understanding to be religion right now. When we look at relig as a part of that word, to reconnect, to bring back together, to recommune, to reattach. And what's being reattached? Who's being reattached? People with one another, people with the divine, people perhaps in some religions with nature, the natural world, with other forms of life. So when you're bringing people together, you're bringing them into a structure that has rules, beliefs, and policies, etc. And so that's the institutional aspect of it. Spirituality is a quest for meaning that often involves an acknowledgement that one has a spirit that needs connection with others, with nature, with the divine. There's usually an awareness of some connection to some other power, some invisible force or power that is sustaining. And so one can experience spirituality in the context of religious life. Of course, that happens all the time, but religious institutions are not needed to experience spirituality. I wrote a piece when I was in seminary on how I really didn't experience God that much in church when I was growing up. I like church for the social things it did for me. I did not feel that I experienced God in church. Do you know where I experienced it, India?
Where?
In my father's garden.
Mm.
In my house, my father's the one who kept the garden.
That's a very Caribbean thing, by the way.
Yeah. My dad would make us get off our bikes and stop playing double dutch and all those things and come to the garden. We were doing organic gardening when I was like 8, 9, 10, and I didn't even know. So he kept gardens. He grew so much of our food, the callaloo, the mint tea, all those things that Jamaicans love. And I remember looking at how the color would come into the vegetables and be fascinated just by that and have this intense feeling of connection to a divine presence that could make that happen. Color is divine to me. And to see the color ooze into our nurture in that way, it was so profound to me. My experiences with the divine have always been in nature. Always. My powerful experiences with the divine have never been in church buildings. I just say that to explain that spirituality does not need to be housed in a religious institution. People can experience it in all kinds of ways.
And so for you, your experiences in your father's garden really harkens back to other kinds of traditions related to survival, and that our peoples relied on ethnobotany for survival. And when the traditional approaches to health may not work or doesn't really make sense, we always have the bush tea. We have this thing, that thing to drink and to rub and create a salve. Scholars would assert that African descendants across the diaspora were actually forced into religion. They were forced into Christianity. But then you also have another faction of scholars that clarify that religion, Christianity, for example, was already present on the continent in places like Egypt and Ethiopia, long before the transatlantic slave trade that brought a good segment of us to this side of the world. I think in many ways, people's resistance or trying to understand the distinctions between religion vis-a-vis spirituality is really because Christianity is perceived as a white man's religion. So can you speak to the role of the body, of ritual, and everyday practice in African diasporic religions, particularly in contrast to what people understand as traditional Christian traditions?
Right, yes. And of course, there is a wide variety in Christianity as well. And I think Black presence within the Christian tradition is a part of that because what we've done is we've taken our embodied religion into the Christian context as well. So some of what I will talk about now will also be applicable to a lot of the Black sanctified traditions. And we know historically that many white Christians in the American experience, for sure, I'm not saying that there was not ecstatic religious expression in white traditions outside of their encounter with Blacks, but anthropologists have noted and historians that because of the interaction between Blacks and whites in this country, whites certainly picked up religious motor behavior from Blacks in these ecstatic traditions when they are represented there. The body includes the mind for me. And it is my study of African heritage religions. And what I mean by that, my ethnographic study, my engagement with practitioners, custodians of these traditions in the field that has really made me pay attention to that. The body is a vessel of religious knowledge, of revelation, revelatory knowledge. One of the constants in African heritage religions. I like that concept, by the way. I've kind of shifted to that around 2015. I use it for both the continent because we have Islam, we have Christianity there as visitor religions. I like African heritage religions to represent what people have termed in the past indigenous religions or African traditional religions or African religious traditions. So I like it for the continent and the diaspora as well. So when I use African heritage religions for the diaspora, I'm talking about traditions like Kumina in Jamaica, Vodou in Haiti and Louisiana, Hoodoo, you name it, candomblé in Brazil. So I'm talking about those kinds of traditions.
Lukumi.
Lukumi, exactly. So the body is such an important ritual element. And what I mean by that is people pray through bodily movements. Through dance, people are actually praying. There are times when people pray through words or maybe communicate with the divine through words, for sure. But the body is also a form of prayer. Vodou ceremonies in Benin and in Haiti, when the dancers move forward in a row in the invocatory space and time of a ceremony, that is prayer. That is calling the divine. That is dance, music, meaning the communication with the drums. They are living, breathing, revelatory instruments of the divine as well, which are always consecrated to ask the divine to come and be with us. So the body is central. But one of the things I discovered over the years in doing research, the mind is in the body too. And so this bifurcation that, people of African descent are really focused on the body and European traditions really focus on the mind, I want to eviscerate that.
All right.
What I have seen in the diasporic field is that custodians, respected elders, teachers, and leaders in these religious traditions often talk about dreams, visions, these experiences that are of the mind. So there is a mind connection with the divine that direct them to particular herbal plants, give them instruction on how they must collect and prepare medicine for their clients, give them instructions on particular acts of devotion to perform. It's incredible. And one of the things that I hear constantly is that through the transatlantic slave trade, we didn't remember everything, but the ancestors and the Orisha or the whichever divine entities are venerated in that tradition, they constantly communicate with us and give us those remedies. They help us. They show us what to do. So I want to emphasize that visionary experience, dreams, those aspects of receiving divine communication are also very important and an important part of bodily experience in African heritage religions in the diaspora and on the continent. Movement is a part of how people perceive revelation. When the divinities climb up into the body cavity, because in the Orisha tradition, even in Congo-based traditions, it is what is under the earth that is so important. Wow. It is known that the Orisha are buried. Most of them live deep in the core of the earth. Those Orisha climb up the body. In Haiti, they talk about the medium being mounted by the spirit because the spirit is climbing up. This is why they dance barefoot, to make that direct contact with the earth, climbs up the body cavity. the medium becomes the host of that divine entity, they become God. That is a very sacred and momentous religious rite to perform. They become God. I've been to ceremonies in Trinidad, Orisha ceremonies, where people will perform certain quick rites, quick rituals to stave off what has been called possession, trance. I prefer manifestation. That's the words that the practitioners use in Trinidad. I love the Brazilian candomblé term incorporation as well. I think that's so beautiful. So I prefer manifestation or incorporation. So I asked them, why did you put the rum on your face? I know why. They're like, look, I got to go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning. I don't have time to have manifestation tonight. This is work. This is real serious work, and I can't do it tonight. Not tonight, Very practical and pragmatic. But when the deity enters the body cavity, the community knows, it's beyond belief. They are interacting with the deity. This is no longer the person. This is the deity. So the body is very important. We have been taught that religion is about texts, rituals, a certain philosophy. It is revealed religion through a text. But guess what? There are many traditions where what is revealed through the body, through movement. It's not always through written text. And all of those texts were orature before they were written down. The body is absolutely central. And I want us to be thinking about the moving body, but also the mind-body connection with the divine, where instruction and knowledge is continually transmitted.
So, immediately this connection between the mind and body, I see that, and as you were speaking, reflecting on even my own experience, also growing up Catholic, but then attending two different Catholic churches. There was one in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, that I attended with my grandmother. The priest was from one of the islands. The congregation was majority from the islands. Our worship in Catholic Mass at that church felt very Pentecostal. We had the choirs, and although they were singing more operatic, they had the tambourine, they had all of these other things. People were catching the Holy Ghost, even though within the framework of Catholicism, as I understood it as a child, we didn't really frame it that way about catching the Holy Ghost or speaking in tongues, as I would later come to know when I would also visit friends of mine who were Pentecostal and attended their church, versus when I went to another Catholic church in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, where the parishioners were predominantly white, and how we worshiped, and it felt very different. I love the connection where you're saying that even within acknowledging and tapping into the orishas, how very much connected it is to all of the natural elements. It makes sense when you have Yamaya, when you're having all of the other orishas, where it's about the land, the water, the air, because we are of that as people. So why not be able to connect into that spiritually? I think I'm still sort of stuck, and I'm sure I'm not alone, because how is it that these practices, these rituals, how these things show up for us in every day, even through oral culture and oral tradition? I witnessed my grandmother putting patuas in her purse, and I didn't understand. I just thought that that's something that everyone does. And it wasn't until much later on that I'm thinking, oh no, that is something that's very specific, that we transfer all of that. We lean into all of that culturally. But then there's still heavy stigmatization about saying that we actually do that. It's almost like a bifurcation of we do that in private, but then when we outside, don't say all that. Maybe it's the same fears of criminalization and alienation that our ancestors experienced. But I find that so troubling when you are in proximity to or a part of these rituals. I feel it. Feel it come from all the way below in my stomach and up towards my chest. It's a very physical thing that how can we not acknowledge that this exists for us as a people?
I identify with that so much. I feel the divine when those drums are playing. I feel it. And I'm going to share something with you that I hardly talk about. I don't know if you're familiar with the Revival Zion tradition in Jamaica. So it is one of those traditions that grew out of an older 18th century, at least 18th century is when it begins to be noted in the records of planters and other white observers in Jamaica. A tradition called Mayal. And Mayal comes from the Kikongo, I should say, root term Mayala, to govern, to have governing power. All traditional rulers in Congo were understood to be endowed with divine Mayal, governing power. So these Mayo dances would appear. Enslaved Africans would get together to dance together in this ritual, and it was called Mayo. Well, it was suppressed early in the 1800s, I should say, and after Samuel Sharp's leading of what was eventually called the Native Baptist War, because Mayo religion was at the foundation of this rebellion, so to speak. So what they did was they just reinvented themselves and continued to incorporate the Baptist tradition, the 1860s, as revival Zionists. I mean, they're two separate lineages. They sometimes merge as one, but let's just call them revival Zionists or revival. This tradition is deeply rooted in African ways of relating to the spirit. I was doing ethnographic research in Kingston at a major revival church, and I was doing what I would call more participant observation. And the spirit overtook me. I had to go outside. I have never, ever had the Holy Ghost. But I personally have never had it, not even any kind of inclination that anything like that would happen. Attending Pentecostal churches, Sanctified Baptist churches, never had it. I felt that I was going to go into the spirit in that church.
Mm.
The power of the rituals, the singing, the drumming. I felt that it was going to happen, and I went outside. I am not a drinker, but I also don't like that feeling of inebriation. Not that I've had it, but that feeling of kind of being out of control. And I realize that's important in religious experiences, religious traditions, but I don't like it personally. And I went outside and walked it off. I often have to remind Christians that Jesus was not only not white, he was not a Christian. He was probably a brown, I don't know what color exactly, but probably a brown Hebraic person from Palestine. That's who Jesus was. And he would be looking at Christians today saying, what kind of religion that is? I'm teasing, I'm quoting Nana Pazant from the movie Daughters of the Dust. That's what Jesus is saying. He was taking sacrifices and offerings to the temple, okay? It's really interesting that this tradition that emerged out of a community trying to make sense of their leader's death. How could this man of God, this anointed person, this Messiah die, get crucified? Here they are trying to make sense of his death. And it begins to develop into an institutional religion under the leadership of someone like Paul. There were other authorities out there, and that's why we see contentious theologies in those New Testament letters. They're taking it in a direction that makes sense for them and their communities and forging a Christian tradition. But because Black people are so connected to Jesus, right? I know a pastor who's initiated, by the way, to Orisha. He just retired here in Atlanta. He was a pastor for maybe 30 years. He says Jesus is the most overworked Orisha. What we did as African people, all of those different principles and values and powers that we associated with, we just put them all in Jesus. He's the way maker, the baby maker, my friend, my mother, And so I just like to remind Black Christians of that Jesus himself didn't belong to this religion that everyone is rigidly promoting as some sort of set of rules that's over and against all other religions of the world. That just wasn't Jesus's mission. My feeling is that you have the freedom as a Christian to be who you are and not denigrate other religious traditions. You truly have that freedom, because then you're probably going to be denigrating Jesus' tradition. He was a Hebrew, right? You're going to be denigrating his tradition too. I think essential to the colonial process, probably the core of it, was colonizing the mind and the spirit. The demonization of African heritage religions. Let's just think about this from the perspective of trauma. I often remind students that Europeans were conquered by Christianity through domination, violence, extreme suffering. And what they did was they took that and externalized it on the worlds they colonized as well. We often see Christianity, what they were skilled at is naturalizing it as their religion. But it wasn't. And I often think that some of the searching and the seeking that we see with a number of white liberals is about that, is about their loss of connection to their intangible heritages, right? So, first of all, there's a trauma there, and that has been externalized on us. So, when they saw the indigenous religious practices of Africans and Native Americans and Asians, and that reminded them of their old traditions that, oh my God, those are demonic. They're even more demonic because these are practiced by dark people. They had a revulsion to dark skin, to blackness itself. They ontologized pigmentation and made it identity and placed it on a hierarchy. So that now is fully embedded within the Christianities that they brought to us. All of the colors of white and black, light and darkness now have an ideological valence attached to it that constantly reminds us of black identities versus white identities, which are constructed ones, by the way, right? So that's what we're wrestling with. And that is so foundational. It is anchoring to the experience of what it means to be made a black slave. These are not naturalized identities. There were no Africans before the Europeans came and captured people. Right. There were no black people. Those people did not think of themselves that way. They probably identified themselves on the continent that we are unifying as Africa as a whole through their surnames, their connections to clans, to local leaders and nations. That's how those people were identifying themselves. I have friends from when I was studying abroad in Nigeria as an undergrad who told me my parents studied in England and they didn't even see themselves as African until they went to England. It just was not a major identity for them until they went and faced the same things other continentals were facing. And they began to really embrace their Africanness rather than their local nation name. I prefer the language of nation than ethnic. We're talking about deep psychological and spiritual violence. We also have to remember, you will see a phenomenal account of this in Tracy Hawks's volume attached to my volume on our work in Trinidad, where she really lays out the colonial violence against practitioners of African heritage religions. So to reinforce the psychological violence, the physical, the punitive approach to managing and exterminating anyone who practiced African religions is also part of that heritage and that legacy. And that does create automatic responses and behaviors and lessons for survival that ancestors have passed down to us. And let's face it, the overarching explanation for slavery was that we were heathens and we needed to be brought under divine revelation. Even though it was really bad, that was the good that came out of the slave trade. Really, really sad and really hurtful. And there's no way that we can truly love ourselves and be satisfied with ourselves as persons, creatures made in the image of the divine. I'm using a Christian concept here. If we have not jettisoned those beliefs and ideas. And I think they're lodged deeply in our spiritual and social experiences and cultures. It's hard to shake that.
I have to share something that's genuinely changed my sleep. I love my Cozy Earth bamboo sheets. They're unbelievably soft, breathable, and feel like luxury every single night. Treat yourself by using my 21% off discount code, which is belong to black at cozyearth.com. And know that we earn a commission when you use our code. So when you buy, you're also supporting the podcast. Find my discount code in the episode description and get luxurious sleep your body will appreciate. I know mine does. Act 2, The Road. So as a nice segue always in this part of the show, I enjoy asking all of my guests the same question, and I'm curious to hear your response. How do you play?
I love that question because my professional life really tries to stop me from playing, you know, and it takes up so much of my world. When I think about play, of course, I think about children in my life. They remind me of the power of play, like my nieces and nephews that are still children. Honestly, my most exhilarating moments of play have been in nature, have been along the shoreline of the Atlantic coast, the parts of the shoreline where you can't swim because those oceanic waves are crashing in, just playing with those waves and running back and forth and moving with the rhythm of the water has been incredibly exhilarating. Going to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and seeing where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet, that has been a divine experience
Wow.
that was so exhilarating. It was a moment of play for me to just reflect and relax in experiencing the awe and the majesty of our natural world, of this universe. Very, very powerful. So I do experience a lot of moments of play, I feel, in nature. I also experience moments of play in music and dance, which I love, an important part of my upbringing. My parents, by the way, they sing. They grew up singing. I mean,
Yeah.
communication was sung in so many ways. Even the natural patois that our Caribbean people speak, it's a song. If you really think deeply about how our vocabularies like slide into one another, it's a song. They sang a lot, but they weren't really music people, you know, but we were as kids and our whole social environment. We were music people. We were watching Soul Train on Saturday mornings. We were always up on the latest hits, practicing these dances for church fashion shows and all this kinds of stuff, going to parties and things like that. That is beautiful play. And even as an adult, I still love that. I think many people who don't know me well would be surprised, but I love a good party. That's another way that I play.
Culturally, yes, we may have different linguistic structures to the patois, but it can be very sing-songy.
Yes,
You know, some islands' accents are a little bit more sing-songy than others.
absolutely. Trinidad is more than Jamaica, for example. Yeah,
I always think of Jamaica as having a lot of bass.
a lot of bass. I love that. Very true. Excellent analysis.
So, in your book, Obia, Orisha, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, for you in particular, in terms of your research, you've really challenged syncretic frameworks by saying that it's more nuanced and complex as opposed to just saying that what African descendants on this side of the world practice is a mashup, which is a very simplistic analysis to what you've been describing and explaining to us. So, why is this analysis more nuanced and complex? And what does the analysis tell us about Black identity and memory?
I really like this question because, believe it or not, I did not want to address syncretism in the book. And Tracy pushed me to do it. And I'm so tired of this debate and this issue in religious studies. I don't even want to give it airtime, right? I don't want to give it space. And she says, you have to. We are the first scholars to write full book length studies
Mm.
on African religions in Trinidad in the field of religion. There are a growing number of anthropologists who've written about these traditions, but anthropologists study cultures. They study human stories and human ways of being at a particular time in history, a particular moment. Their works are very presentist. They're not giving a historical account oftentimes of how these traditions emerge. And they're not necessarily guided by the kinds of questions about religious imagination and the power of religious communion the way we are as scholars of religion. They don't do as much work on interiority as we do as scholars of religion. She had to really push, but she really did convince me to do it. And I'm glad I did it because in digging deeply into my gathered source material, I began to realize that there's something deeper at work in how people of African descent have composed, have repurposed, have transmitted inherited religious cultures in new contexts. So, syncretism, I would not object to the word on the face of it. All cultures are syncretic. All cultures are always absorbing new material and putting it to use in unique ways that matter to the people who are upholding the culture or the religion at the time. So that's fine. If we used it indiscriminately in the field of religious studies, I wouldn't have written anything, except for the fact that syncretism often is reserved for the religions of people who've been colonized. And it's become such a convenient way to encapsulate the essence of African heritage religions in the Americas and the Caribbean. And it's too easy. Honestly, I think it's lazy. So let me give you an example. I'm at my first job coming out of my PhD program. I taught at Macalester College in Minnesota. And one of my colleagues, very well-meaning, I was showing Maya Duren's film on Haitian Vodou in my class that day. He saw the film, he saw me pull it out, and he's like, oh, that looks interesting. And so we were talking about it and what I was going to do. And he said, oh, so who's Saint Michael? And I always remember that question, right? And I told him, I actually don't know. I actually don't know because I don't study that. So I did that for effect to some degree because what I wanted to do was shift the conversation away from these simplistic associations between the Vodou and the Catholic saints and go deeper, ask the question of what's really going on in the ritual space, in the devotional space as practitioners relate to their loa in the Haitian context. What I really landed on was that custodians of African heritage religions are familially oriented, and they are constantly open to expanding the family of powers with which they deal. They're also very much accustomed to the Orisha, the Loa, having multiple appellations, multiple titles, honorifics. So adding another one, a Catholic saint name, it fits within their system for how they operate. The Orisha are a family of powers, and that's how practitioners speak of them, understand them. One of the most important portals to understanding African heritage religions is the concept of the family. If your grandmother came to visit you, you would put out a beautiful set for her to eat, a plate, pour her drink. That's what they do for their Orisha, right? This is about hospitality, respect, co-reliance. It's about all of those values and principles that are important in holding a family together. And so incorporating the saints, you can call it a syncretism, those principles, those values, those associations that their ancestors have transmitted to them. That's what grounds what's happening in their relationship with that power. And in Trinidad, they literally call the Orisha powers. They do. I love that language as well. I mean, in Trinidad, the Yoruba tradition, Orisha tradition, emerged after slavery. It was not a slave religion. There were barely any Yorubas there by the end of slavery in Trinidad. The Yorubas are coming in as part of the transatlantic slave trade. They begin their journeys as captured peoples en route to places like Cuba and Brazil that were still deeply embedded in the practice of slavery. It's the late 1880s when slavery is fully abolished in Cuba and Brazil, 1886 and 1888. But in the Anglophone Caribbean, we're looking at 1834 and then really 1838, a 45-year period where it's still going on elsewhere. Well, those Yorubas that ended up settling in Trinidad were captured from slave ships by the British Navy. If they were able to seize human contraband captives aboard slave ships, they could rescue them. They could liberate them. They were not thinking we're enslaved and we have to hide our traditions. Now, certainly they were also entering a society that was increasingly becoming anglicized. Trinidad had long been a kind of French Creole culture governed officially by the Spanish, but so many neighboring French settlers moved there because of the encouragement from the cedula of 1783 and brought enslaved Africans with them. And so when the British took over and began to try to transition the island to an English-speaking island. That took time. I can remember growing up with friends who were Trinidadian whose grandparents still spoke French, or French Creole. So it took a while for that Anglicization to really take root. And so the Yoruba are coming in that context. They believe that they have legitimate spiritual practices. Remember that Hindus and Muslims are coming from South Asia as well. It's not just them with Christians. Everyone is kind of navigating this religious complex and making these arguments that we have a right to practice our religion, right? So the simple thing is that they're just hiding their gods under Catholicism. No, these are traditions that have no problem with religious comparison. They're not trying to denigrate. They're not oriented toward demonizing other traditions. They're open. They can learn from, they can incorporate other traditions into what they're doing and still hold their basic framework. And the problem that I have with syncretism, it's like we have a little bit of this disoriented, inferior African religious culture here, and then we have the structured, strong traditions of Catholicism here to really keep all of this African disoriented stuff together.
Right.
That's just wrong and absolutely ridiculous. To be honest, we have some of that thinking too, just even within the realm of the studies of African heritage religions, where there are a number of people who've said, and even in academic writing, but it's also common among practitioners, that the Yoruba are these highly structured religious practitioners, and that's why their traditions survived and are most known. That's not true. The Yoruba came last, because they came as the Oyo Empire was declining. And we're talking about the 1830s. They're coming very late. Slavery is over in the Caribbean in the 1830s. So they're coming late into the diaspora. That's, I believe, one of the reasons their traditions are so strong and most remembered. But the other layers of African traditions find their way into these different nation practices where religion was held together and was able to become an institution that could be transmitted.
African heritage traditions have also been critical as a tool, not just for healing trauma, but also as a tool around political nation building. And when I'm localizing it to, say, specific the Caribbean, that's what makes Haiti, Haiti. Or just why we practice and show up in the way we practice in Jamaica versus in Trinidad and Grenada and Barbados and all of these other kinds of places. I appreciate holding space to say, well, let's not just diminish the power of what these heritage traditions and practices are really about and what they stand for as just something to be a covert thing, but it's something that people are really choosing to honor and to venerate. I appreciate the explanation and the distinction that you're making and sharing with us today.
One other component that I think is important, the impetus to affiliate with social groups and guilds. It was so important in African life. I mean, people became adults. They became people. They really lived into the fullness of their humanity as they joined particular age groups and social groups and religious organization and professional guilds where there were initiatory experiences that required passing of tests to say, I am an insider now. I have earned my place because I am a person who knows. I have knowledge. My eyes have been opened, as they would say in a lot of African heritage religions. That kind of quest to affiliate with guilds and societies is very, very deep in the DNA of African people. And so the Catholic Church was one of those societies. It offered a structured opportunity for association. That's why they had all of their different brotherhoods and guilds. That rang so authentic to custodians of African cultures and heritages. So that's another thing to remember. And they Africanized them in their own way. We might think, oh, that's caving in, that's giving in to the Catholic Church, or they were being disingenuous. No, they knew that that church had power, and getting initiated into that structure was really in alignment with Yoruba values of initiation, knowledge acquisition, and then responsibility based on what you know. That was familiar to them, right? And then achieving status and prestige as a result of that. So I also want readers to think about that as well. It is also very important for thinking about how they understood what it meant to mature through the life cycle and how one did that. One did that by becoming initiated into societies and learning and then acting as a responsible person based on what one now knows as a member. That's why so many would also join the Masons and all these other guilds, even our working class Black communities. All my friends' grandmothers were going to the Eastern Star when I was growing up. That is a proclivity, I think, in people of African descent. And I think it's deeply rooted to our cultural heritages in Africa.
What excites you or even concerns you about how African diasporic religions are being represented and practiced today? And I'm curious about the forthcoming book that you have.
I think there are positives and negatives, but certainly more positives than what I did see 2, 3 decades ago in the media, in the public, on television. Many of the images of African heritage religions were denigrating images, were images that compromised the integrity and the substance of what these traditions are about. But now we have, especially since the rise of what I would call primarily middle class, if even lower middle class, African descendants who live in the United States and in other parts of the world, but I think the United States has especially led the way in this, expressing interest, connecting to African heritage religions in very serious ways, actually seeking initiation, becoming priests that also initiate other persons as well. And I'm using priests to include women and men here. And so that is exciting because what we're seeing is connections between and across the entire diaspora through organizations like the Orisha World Congress, for example, through similar organizations where practitioners and those who want to learn and understand can attend conferences that move from different parts of the diaspora, get together, share ritual experiences, ritual content and materials, invite practitioners and priests from Nigeria, other parts of West Africa, even Benin. And I remember being told that the government holds classes on divination, indigenous culture, indigenous religions that are totally free to anybody from the African diaspora. That if I wanted to stay and take classes, I would not have to pay anything. I'm excited about those efforts to reach one another across the Atlantic Ocean through these amazing spiritual networks. That's exciting. And seeing people seek substantive knowledge and move forward. What does concern me is the quest for power and capital accumulation that can often make these relationships fraught or put these relationships in jeopardy across the oceans. We know that there are a number of Nigerian priests or even pretended priests that are just giving out titles and things for money because African diasporic people are so hungry for that kind of authenticity. That's an important part of our religious quest. It can be tempting for certain people who are in West Africa to take advantage of that kind of yearning, that is happening and that is a problem. The other thing that does concern me, oftentimes, as much as what's being stated by the practitioner or the religious leader, is that we are Yoruba, Ifa now. We are Ifa practitioners. We're not Christian, we're not Muslim. But they're often carrying these Christian overlays into the tradition and kind of practicing it like Christians. Talking about, for example, a Babalawo as a high priest. There are no high priests in Yoruba religion. There is no such thing as a Babalawo as a high priest. That does not exist. There are ways that we really are still bringing those Christian theological frames to the practice, even though we think we're not. The patriarchy that is being brought over into the tradition, a tradition that is not endemically patriarchal. We have female priests in this tradition. And no, it is not true that women cannot be Ifa. So part of what we're doing is bringing the patriarchy of the Christian church, of Islam, or of our Western culture into the tradition. That does concern me. I really would like to see a little bit more reflection upon that. And if people are deliberately doing that, then fine. But don't think that you have totally disabused yourself of all of these Christian influences and you're practicing the pure Yoruba. Religion is always growing, always changing, always bringing in influences. That's what makes it what it is. Kola Bimbola talks about the elasticity of the Yoruba religion. He
Mm.
talks about scriptures or what we would call like Odu from the Ifa corpus that actually instructs certain people to become Christian and to become Muslim. And he says it's because the Ifa, the Yoruba tradition, understands that we must practically relate to one another. We must get along in a multicultural, multi-religious world.
Act 3, Where We Land. All right, Dianne. So before we part, please, can you share any upcoming events, talks, showcases, things that you have going on or that are upcoming? And more importantly, where can people find you to learn more, to stay in touch, and to get involved?
Thank you so much. So I will be offering a keynote address at a major event in Kingston, Jamaica, and it's being hosted by Dr. Lantoinette Steins, who is the founder of a major, amazing dance company, originally located in Brooklyn, and she's now living in Jamaica, I think, permanently. She is also an Orisha priestess. Her dance company performs many of the varieties of African dance vocabularies, but she also developed her own technique, and she's known for innovating on the African dance vocabularies. And so she asked me to open up the program. I think it's a 5-day program. It's serious. It's going to include rituals at the ocean. All kinds of things are happening. I don't have the full outline yet. The theme is dancing the ancestral fire, FYAH. She wants me to talk about our religious heritage and its significance to our independence. And so I am very eager and excited to do that. And that's going to be on August 1st, which is Emancipation Day in the Anglophone Caribbean. It is also my grandfather's birthday, very special day. Also a book project. It's tentatively titled Local and Transnational Legacies of African Christianity in West Central Africa and the Black Atlantic World. My engagement with custodians of African heritage religions in Jamaica and Trinidad led me to this project. Tracing the spiritual legacies of the Congolese prophet Kimpavita. She was a 17th, 18th century young woman, really a teenager, who was very gifted and wanted to reunite the Kingdom of Congo and the slave trade.
Mm.
And she was killed by the state, but basically because the Capuchin missionaries required it. She was a threat to what they were doing in the region. And her disciples were exported through the slave trade. We're talking tens of thousands of people. How Congolese folks and West Central Africans who were introduced to or influenced by or practicing Catholics, how they influenced Vodou in Haiti and Candomblé in Brazil and other religious practices. But people have not done that for the Protestant world. Those spiritual legacies in Trinidad, Jamaica, and the Southeastern Gullah communities, there are so many Black Christians who don't want to give up their Christian heritage, but they want to be able to express their African spirituality, their African religious heritage. And this book will speak to that. So my website is diannemstewart.com, and Dianne is Dianne, M as in Marie, my middle name, Stewart, Stewart.com. And X handle is Dianne M Stewart, Dianne with the 2 N's. IG and Facebook are Dianne M Stewart, PhD.
Well, there you have it, folks. Dr. Dianne M Stewart. Thank you for joining us here on Belonging to Blackness. This was quite a rich and interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yndia. It was a pleasure to be your guest today.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and be sure to subscribe. Find us on my website, www.indialoricwilmot.com. Follow us on IG and Facebook at belongingtoblackness_podcast for the latest fashion and accessories. Visit www.shopbelongingtoblackness.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.